Blood dripped onto the photograph of his dead brother as Clyde Knox realized everything was a lie. The classified documents scattered across his desk revealed the devastating truth. His billion-dollar empire was built on betrayal. Sirens wailed outside Knox Defense Industries as the woman who destroyed everything stood in his doorway, her dark eyes blazing with righteous fury. "Your brother didn't die in combat, Clyde," Stella Bridges whispered, her voice cutting through his world like a blade. "He was murdered." The crimson drop landed squarely on Marcus's face and the photograph, and Clyde watched as it began to seep into the paper, staining his brother's uniform. His hands trembled as he looked up at the woman who just shattered his reality. 3 years of building Knox Defense Industries to honor his fallen Marine brother. 3 years of believing he was protecting American soldiers with superior equipment. 3 years of trusting the man who'd mentored him through grief. All of it crumbling with 5 devastating words. Stella Bridges stepped into his corner office as federal agents swarmed the building below. Even with chaos erupting around them, she commanded attention. Her military bearing spoke of years spent in courtrooms, fighting for justice. Her dark eyes holding the kind of unwavering determination that could topple governments. She wore a simple black suit that couldn't disguise her athletic build, and her natural hair was styled in a way that suggested she had no time for vanity when truth was at stake. "You have 60 seconds before they arrest you for conspiracy," she said, pulling a thick manila folder from her briefcase. "Or you can listen to what your brother died trying to expose." Clyde's steel-gray eyes fixed on the folder as his world tilted off its axis. The sirens grew louder, but all he could hear was the thundering of his own pulse. At 40, he'd survived losing his parents, losing Marcus, building an empire from nothing. But this felt like the first time he might actually break. "Marcus wrote you a letter before he died," Stella continued, her voice gentler now as she seemed to recognize his shock. "It's been classified for 3 years. I was his JAG lawyer, Clyde. I've been investigating his death since the day they brought his body home." The June afternoon sunlight streaming through his office windows caught the scattered documents, each one a piece of evidence that his mentor Max Vega had orchestrated every aspect of his success to keep him from asking the right questions. Purchase orders, inspection reports, correspondence between Vega and Pentagon officials. It painted a picture of systemic corruption that made Clyde's stomach churn. "Why now?" he managed, his voice hoarse with the weight of 3 years' worth of betrayal. "Because in 2 weeks, Admiral Sterling is going to testify before Congress about military procurement fraud. She's risking everything to expose this conspiracy, and Vega knows it." Stella's eyes never left his face as she opened the folder. Marcus discovered that faulty equipment was being sold to Marines like him, equipment that cost lives. He was going to expose it all until someone made sure he couldn't. Clyde's gaze fell to Marcus's letter, written in his brother's familiar handwriting. The paper was stained and worn, as if it had been read 1,000 times by someone who cared about every word. "Read it," Stella said softly. "Then decide if you want to finish what he started, or if you want to keep living the lie that killed him." The building shook as federal agents continued their sweep of the lower floors. Through his windows, Clyde could see news vans arriving, reporters already spinning whatever story would sell the most papers. By tomorrow, Knox Defense Industries would either be vindicated as the clean company in a corrupt industry, or destroyed along with everything he'd built to honor his brother's memory. But as his fingers touched the letter that would change everything, Clyde Knox realized that the choice had never really been his to make. Marcus had died for the truth, and the woman standing before him had spent 3 years of her life seeking justice for a Marine she'd barely known. The sirens wailed outside like a dirge for everything he'd believed, but in Stella Bridges' unwavering gaze, he saw something that made his pulse quicken for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. She wasn't just offering him the truth about his brother's death. She was offering him a chance to be the man Marcus had died believing he could be. 3 years ago, when Marine Staff Sergeant Marcus Knox died in what the Pentagon called equipment failure incident, his younger brother Clyde had channeled his grief into building something that would honor Marcus's sacrifice. Knox Defense Industries started in a garage with Clyde's MIT engineering degree, his military trust fund, and the mentorship of Max Vega, the former Navy SEAL, who'd promised to teach him how the defense industry really worked. Your brother died because someone cut corners on gear that should have saved his life, Vega had told him during those early months when grief made it hard to breathe. We're going to make sure that never happens to another Marine. Now, staring at Stella Bridges as she stood in the wreckage of everything he believed, Clyde understood that Vega's words had been true, just not in the way he'd thought. Marcus discovered that Hexagon Defense was selling substandard body armor to the Marines, Stella explained, pulling out inspection reports marked with his brother's handwriting. Armor that looked perfect on paper, but failed when it mattered most. He wasn't the first to die because of it, and he wouldn't have been the last. Clyde's hands clenched into fists as he absorbed the implications. Hexagon Defense, Vega's main competitor. The company Knox Defense had been systematically underbidding for the past 3 years. Every contract they'd won, every piece of equipment that had saved American lives, had been built on his mentor's guidance about where Hexagon was cutting corners. Vega was feeding you information about their weaknesses, Stella continued, her voice steady despite the chaos outside. Not to help you compete fairly, but to make sure you'd destroy them before Marcus's evidence could surface. Every success you had, every life your equipment has saved, it was all designed to keep you too busy and too grateful to ask why your brother really died. The truth hit him like physical violence. Knox Defense hadn't succeeded because of his engineering brilliance or business acumen. It had succeeded because Max Vega had been playing a game that Clyde hadn't even known existed, using his grief and his need to honor Marcus as weapons against his own family. The irony is that your equipment really is superior, Stella said, almost gently. Your innovations have saved hundreds of lives over the past 3 years, but Vega never intended for you to become his competition. He thought he could control you indefinitely. Through the glass walls of his office, Clyde could see federal agents moving through the building with practiced efficiency. His employees, engineers, and manufacturers who believed they were serving their country watched in confusion as their workplace became a crime scene. If you've ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted completely, you understand how Clyde Knox felt in that moment. That devastating realization that the foundation of your entire life was built on lies, that everything you thought you knew about yourself and your purpose was carefully orchestrated by someone else. But sometimes, betrayal becomes the catalyst for discovering who we really are when all the illusions fall away. Why should I trust you? Clyde asked, though even as he spoke the words, he found himself leaning toward her truth instead of away from it. Stella reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small digital recorder. Because Marcus trusted me enough to send me this the night before he died. She pressed play, and suddenly Marcus's voice filled the office, alive, determined, and achingly familiar. Stella, if you're hearing this, then Vega got to me before I could get to the hearing. I need you to find my brother Clyde and tell him everything. He's the only one smart enough and stubborn enough to finish this fight. The evidence is in my personal effects, the ones they'll try to bury with military honors. Don't let them turn my death into their propaganda. Clyde's vision blurred as his brother's voice continued, outlining a conspiracy that reached deep into the Pentagon's procurement system. Marcus had discovered not just Hexagon's corruption, but an entire network of defense contractors who were treating American soldiers' lives as acceptable losses in pursuit of profit. He believed in you, Stella said, as the recording ended. Even knowing he might die for exposing this, he believed you'd have the courage to do what was right. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway made them both tense. Stella moved closer to Clyde's desk, her proximity bringing the scent of her perfume, something subtle and professional that couldn't quite hide the underlying warmth of her skin. For a moment, despite everything crashing down around them, Clyde found himself noticing the way afternoon light caught the golden undertones in her dark complexion, the way her fingers moved with surgeon-like precision as she organized the evidence. Agent Carlson is about to walk through that door, Stella said quietly. She's not here to arrest you. She's here to offer you a choice. Help us expose the conspiracy, or watch everything you've built get destroyed along with Vega's empire. As if summoned by her words, the office door opened to reveal a woman in her late 30s with platinum blonde hair and ice-blue eyes that missed nothing. Agent Iris Carlson moved with the fluid grace of someone trained in violence, her FBI credentials visible, but her entire bearing suggesting she'd been watching Clyde Knox long before today's raid. "Mr. Knox," Carlson said, her voice carrying just a hint of warmth beneath its professional tone. "I believe you've met Miss Bridges, our consultant on military procurement fraud. We need to talk." Clyde looked between the two women who'd just upended his world, then down at his brother's letter, still clutched in his trembling hands. Outside, the sirens had stopped, but he could hear helicopters circling overhead as news crews tried to get aerial shots of the chaos. In 2 weeks, everything he'd built would either be vindicated or destroyed. The choice wasn't really about trusting Stella Bridges or Agent Carlson. It was about trusting Marcus's final message and the brother who'd believed in him enough to die for the truth. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. And in Stella's answering smile, he saw the first glimpse of hope he'd felt since the moment blood had dripped onto his brother's photograph. The safe house Agent Carlson led them to was a modest townhouse in Arlington, its unremarkable exterior hiding state-of-the-art surveillance equipment and enough secure communication gear to run a small war. Clyde found himself in the strange position of being a fugitive in his own life, watching news reports about Knox Defense Industries from the outside, while federal marshals secured his assets and employees. "Your godfather called 6 times in the last hour," Carlson informed him, setting down a secure phone. "Judge Wellsberg seems very concerned about your welfare." The mention of Teddy Wellsberg sent a fresh wave of nausea through Clyde's chest. The man who'd raised him after his parents died, who'd been like a father through every milestone of his life, who'd celebrated every success of Knox Defense. How deep did this conspiracy reach? "Don't answer yet," Stella advised. Looking up from the evidence boxes she'd been methodically organizing across the dining room table. "We need to understand what he knows before we reveal what we know." The late afternoon sun slanted through the blinds, casting golden stripes across the classified documents that told the story of his brother's final months. Marcus had been meticulous in his investigation, documenting every suspicious equipment failure, every Marine who died using gear that should have protected them. The pattern was clear once he knew to look for it. Hexagon Defense had been cutting costs on materials while inflating performance specifications, and someone in the Pentagon had been helping them hide the deadly results. "Here," Stella said, sliding a handwritten report across the table toward him. "This is from Marcus's last week alive." He'd identified 17 specific instances where Hexagon's gear failed catastrophically. He was planning to present this to the Inspector General. Clyde read his brother's careful documentation, each line written in the precise handwriting he remembered from childhood letters and birthday cards. Marcus had always been the responsible one, the older brother who double-checked homework and made sure Clyde understood the consequences of every decision, even in death. He was still trying to protect people. "The night before the hearing, Marcus called me," Stella continued, her voice taking on a distant quality as she remembered. "He said he'd received a message from someone claiming to have additional evidence. Someone who wanted to meet him privately before he testified." "Vega," Clyde said, the pieces clicking together with sickening clarity. "We think so. Marcus never made it to that meeting. His convoy was hit by an IED on the way, an IED that shouldn't have penetrated his vehicle's armor." The room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and distant traffic. Clyde stared at his brother's handwriting until the letters blurred together, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Marcus had tried to accomplish alone. "He wasn't alone," Stella said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "I was supposed to be his legal counsel at the hearing. We'd been working together for months to build the case." Something in her tone made Clyde look up, and he caught a flash of guilt in her dark eyes before she turned back to the documents. The professional composure she'd maintained all day cracked slightly, revealing the woman beneath the advocate. "You blame yourself," he realized. "I should have stopped him from taking that meeting. Should have insisted on more security. Should have..." She cut herself off, pressing her lips together as if physical force could hold back 3 years of regret. For the first time since she'd walked into his office, Stella Bridges looked vulnerable. Her strong shoulders curved inward slightly, and she rubbed her temple with fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly. The sight of her pain cut through Clyde's own shock, creating an unexpected urge to comfort this woman who'd spent 3 years seeking justice for his brother. "You couldn't have known," he said, moving around the table to stand closer to her. Marcus was stubborn when he thought he was protecting people. He would have found a way to take that meeting, no matter what you said. "I was his lawyer," she whispered. "I was supposed to protect him. And I was his brother. I was supposed to be there with him." The words came out rougher than he'd intended, carrying 3 years of survivor's guilt and sleepless nights. But maybe that's not what either of us was supposed to do. Maybe we were supposed to be here, now, finishing what he started. When Stella looked up at him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears that made his chest tighten with an emotion he hadn't felt since before Marcus died. Not just attraction, though the pull toward her was undeniable, something deeper, a recognition that this woman understood loss and purpose in ways most people never would. "The equipment failure that killed him," Clyde said, his voice dropping to match hers. "What exactly happened?" Stella pulled out a thick technical report, its pages marked with Marcus's annotations and her own legal analysis. His vehicle hit an IED designed to target the specific weak points in Hexagon's armor design. The explosion pattern suggests whoever planted it knew exactly how to maximize damage against that particular protection system. The implications hit Clyde like a physical blow. Not only had someone murdered his brother, they'd done it using knowledge of the very equipment failures Marcus was trying to expose. It was personal, calculated, and absolutely ruthless. "Vega would have known those specifications," he said. "Vega helped design that armor system before he left Hexagon to start his own company," Stella confirmed. "He knew exactly how to kill a Marine using their own protective gear." The rage that filled Clyde's chest was clean and pure, burning away the confusion and betrayal of the past few hours. For 3 years, he'd grieved for a brother who died in combat, honored a sacrifice made in service to their country. Learning that Marcus had actually been assassinated by the very people he'd trusted to protect him transformed that grief into something much more dangerous. "We're going to destroy him," Clyde said, and the quiet certainty in his voice made Stella's eyes widen. "It won't bring Marcus back," she warned. "No, but it'll make sure his death meant something." The intensity of his gaze seemed to affect her as much as it did him. Color rose in her cheeks, and she took a small step backward that somehow brought her closer to the wall and closer to him. The space between them crackled with the kind of tension that had nothing to do with the conspiracy they were unraveling and everything to do with the way her lips parted slightly when she was thinking. "Clyde," she began, but whatever she was going to say was interrupted by the sound of Agent Carlson's footsteps on the stairs. "We've got movement," Carlson announced, entering the room with military efficiency. "Vega just called an emergency board meeting for Knox Defense Industries. He's moving to take control of your company while you're under investigation." The spell between them broke as reality crashed back in. Clyde turned toward Carlson, his business instincts reasserting themselves even as part of his attention remained focused on the woman beside him. "He can't do that. I own 60% of the company outright." "Not if you're arrested for conspiracy before tomorrow's board meeting," Carlson replied grimly. "Which is exactly what he's arranging. Our sources indicate he's prepared to present evidence that you were aware of the procurement fraud all along." "Evidence he manufactured," Stella added, her legal mind already working through the implications. "He's been planning this contingency for 3 years, just in case you ever got too close to the truth." Clyde felt the walls closing in around him, but instead of panic, he experienced a strange sense of clarity. Every decision Vega had guided him through, every contract negotiation and strategic partnership, had been designed to position him as either a useful puppet or a convenient scapegoat. The mentor who'd helped him build an empire was also the architect of its potential destruction. "What do you need from me?" he asked Carlson. "Access to your personal files, corporate communications, anything that can prove you were an unwitting participant rather than a willing conspirator. And we need you to continue acting like you trust Vega while we build the case against him." "Absolutely not," Stella interjected sharply. "If Vega suspects that Clyde knows the truth, he'll kill him just like he killed Marcus. We're not using him as bait." The fierce protectiveness in her voice sent an unexpected warmth through Clyde's chest. After years of being surrounded by employees and business associates who valued him for his wealth and connections, having someone defend him purely because she cared about his safety was intoxicating. "I can handle Vega," he said, though he was looking at Stella rather than Carlson. "He taught me everything I know about strategic thinking. It's time to find out if the student learned well enough to beat the teacher." "This isn't a game, Clyde," Stella said, moving closer to him with renewed urgency. "Vega has killed before. He has resources, connections, and absolutely nothing left to lose if this conspiracy gets exposed." "Then we'd better make sure we expose it properly," he replied, covering her hand with his as she reached toward the evidence files. The contact sent electricity racing up his arm, and from the way her breath caught, she felt it too. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, they stood close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes, could smell the subtle scent of her perfume mixed with the coffee she'd been drinking all afternoon. The urge to comfort her was becoming something more dangerous, something that made him want to pull her against him and promise that he'd keep her safe while she fought for justice. "We should get back to work," Stella said finally, but she didn't move away from his touch. "Yes," he agreed, though neither of them moved for several more heartbeats. Agent Carlson cleared her throat pointedly. "I'll give you both some time to review the evidence. The secure communications equipment is upstairs if you need to make any calls. Try not to let anyone track your location." As Carlson's footsteps retreated up the stairs, Clyde found himself alone with Stella Bridges in a room full of secrets, and the growing awareness that his attraction to her was becoming as dangerous as the conspiracy they were fighting. "We need to be careful," Stella said, though whether she was talking about Vega or the tension between them was unclear. "I know," Clyde replied, finally stepping back to give them both space to breathe. "But Marcus trusted you, and that's enough for me." The smile she gave him was small but genuine, transforming her serious features into something that made his pulse quicken. "Then let's make sure we're worthy of that trust." As they returned to the evidence that would either save or damn them both, Clyde Knox realized that somewhere between learning his brother had been murdered and watching Stella Bridges fight for justice with unwavering determination, he'd begun to hope for more than just clearing his name. He'd begun to hope that when this was over, he might have found someone worth fighting for. The call came at 3 in the morning, jarring them both awake from the exhausted sleep they've finally managed on opposite ends of the safe house couch. Clyde reached for his secure phone with the reflexes of a man accustomed to crisis management, but the voice on the other end made his blood freeze. "Clyde, son, thank God you're safe." Judge Thaddeus Wellsberg's familiar baritone carried the weight of 30 years of surrogate fatherhood. "I've been worried sick since I heard about the raid. Where are you? I'll come get you immediately." Stella was instantly alert beside him, her dark eyes fixed on his face as she read the conflict there. Teddy Wellsberg had been more than a godfather. He'd been the man who'd held Clyde together after his parents died, who taught him to shave and drive and think like a lawyer. The idea that this man might be involved in Marcus's murder felt like losing family all over again. "I'm safe, Teddy," Clyde managed, his voice carefully neutral, "just trying to sort through everything that's happening." "This is all a terrible misunderstanding," Wellsberg continued, and Clyde could hear the genuine distress in his voice. "Max Vega called me tonight. He's very concerned about your welfare, especially with these conspiracy theories circulating about Marcus's death. You know how dangerous it can be when grief makes people see patterns that aren't there." The subtle warning in those words made Stella's jaw tighten. She moved closer to Clyde, near enough that her shoulder brushed his as she leaned in to listen. "What kind of patterns?" Clyde asked. "The kind that could destroy everything you've built to honor your brother's memory. Knox Defense Industries is a beacon of integrity in a corrupt industry, Clyde. Don't let misguided people convince you to tear down what Marcus would have been proud of." The manipulation was so subtle, so perfectly calibrated to his guilt and grief, that Clyde might have missed it if not for the way Stella's hand tightened on his arm. Wellsberg was protecting something, and the careful way he framed his concerns suggested he knew exactly what Clyde had discovered. "I need to think about everything," Clyde said finally. "There's a lot to process." "Of course, son. But don't take too long. There are people who want to use you to settle old scores, and they don't care if they destroy your life in the process. Come home, and we'll work through this together, like we always have." After Clyde ended the call, the silence in the room felt suffocating. Stella was studying his face with the intensity of someone reading a crucial piece of evidence, and what she saw there made her expression soften with sympathy. "He raised you," she said quietly. "After my parents died in that car accident when I was 16, Teddy stepped in without hesitation, made sure I could finish high school, helped me get into MIT. Clyde's voice was hollow with the enormity of what he was beginning to understand. "He was at my graduation, my first job interview, the groundbreaking ceremony for Knox defense. He's been the closest thing to a father I've had for half my life. And now he's protecting the man who killed Marcus." The words hung between them like a death sentence. Clyde stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky. The ordinary suburban street looked peaceful in the early morning light, a stark contrast to the chaos tearing through his personal world. "There has to be another explanation," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. Stella rose from the couch, moving to stand behind him. He could feel her presence like warmth against his back, offering comfort without demanding anything in return. "Clyde, I need to show you something else," she said gently. "I was hoping we wouldn't have to go here, but after that call..." She returned to the evidence boxes and pulled out a file that looked different from the others, older, more worn, marked with classification stamps that had been partially redacted. When she opened it, Clyde saw photographs of a much younger Max Vega in navy dress uniform, standing beside other officers at what looked like a formal ceremony. "This is from 15 years ago," Stella explained. "A Pentagon investigation into equipment procurement irregularities. The investigation was dropped when the lead prosecutor ruled that there wasn't sufficient evidence to proceed." She handed him a document with a signature at the bottom that made his world tilt sideways. Federal Judge Thaddeus Wellsberg, in his capacity as a military prosecutor, had signed off on burying the investigation that might have prevented Marcus's death. "He knew," Clyde whispered. 15 years ago, he knew what Vega was doing and he buried it. We think Vega has been using that favor ever since. Protection in exchange for silence, influence in exchange for cooperation. When Marcus got too close to the truth, Vega called in his debt. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that Clyde felt something fundamental break inside his chest, not just his trust in the man who'd raised him, but his understanding of his entire adult life. Every piece of advice Wellsberg had given him about business, every celebration they'd shared over Knox Defense's success. Every moment of pride in honoring Marcus's memory, all of it had been orchestrated by the very people responsible for his brother's murder. "I don't understand how he could do this," Clyde said, his voice cracking with the weight of 15 years of trust being shattered. "He loved Marcus too. He was devastated when we got the news." "Guilt is a powerful motivator," Stella said softly. "Maybe he thought he was protecting you from a truth that would destroy you. Maybe he convinced himself that letting you build Knox Defense was a way to honor Marcus while keeping you safe from Vega's reach. By lying to me every day for 3 years? By loving you enough to carry the burden alone." The compassion in her voice nearly undid him. Clyde turned from the window to find Stella watching him with an expression that held no judgment, only understanding. She'd seen men destroyed by betrayal, had probably felt it herself in her years fighting institutional corruption. Yet somehow she could still find empathy for a broken old man's misguided attempt at protection. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you keep fighting when everyone you're supposed to trust keeps lying to you?" "Because the alternative is letting the liars win," she replied simply. "And because sometimes, if you're very lucky, you find someone who's fighting for the same things you are." The space between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving. Clyde could see the exhaustion in her dark eyes, the toll that 3 years of seeking justice had taken on her spirit. Yet, she was still here, still fighting, still willing to risk everything to honor his brother's memory. "Stella," he began, not sure what he wanted to say, but knowing he needed to say something before the moment passed. "I know," she whispered, and then she was moving toward him, closing the distance between them with the kind of certainty that came from recognizing something rare and precious. When she reached up to touch his face, her palm warm against his cheek, Clyde felt the careful control he'd maintained since Marcus's death finally begin to crack. 3 years of grief, of building walls to protect himself from further loss, of throwing himself into work to avoid feeling anything too deeply. All of it crumbled under the gentle pressure of her touch. "I'm tired of being alone with this," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "You're not alone anymore," she promised, and when he looked into her eyes, he saw the same recognition he felt, the same awareness that what was happening between them was bigger than the crisis that had brought them together. The kiss began tentatively, a question asked and answered without words. But when Stella's lips parted beneath his, when her hands fisted in his shirt to pull him closer, tenderness transformed into something more urgent. 3 years of suppressed emotion poured out of him, and she met it with her own desperate need for connection, for someone who understood that love and justice weren't mutually exclusive. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clyde rested his forehead against hers and tried to remember how to think clearly. The rational part of his mind knew this was dangerous, that emotions this intense could compromise their mission. But the larger part of him, the part that had been empty since Marcus died, felt alive for the first time in years. "This complicates things," Stella said, though she made no move to step away from him. "Everything was already complicated," he replied, brushing a strand of hair back from her face. "At least now we have something worth fighting for, besides just the truth. Clyde, I know we can't let this distract us from what we need to do. I know Vega is dangerous and the conspiracy goes deeper than we thought. But I also know that in the last 24 hours, you've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Hope," he said simply. "The belief that maybe good people can still win if they're willing to fight hard enough." Stella's smile was soft and genuine, transforming her serious features into something that made his heart race for entirely different reasons than fear or anger. "Then we better make sure we win." As dawn light filled the safe house, and the reality of their situation reasserted itself, Clyde Knox realized that Stella Bridges had become more than just his ally in seeking justice for Marcus. She'd become this anchor in a world where everything else was shifting ground. The one person he could trust completely in a conspiracy built on lies and betrayal. The road ahead would be dangerous, potentially deadly. Vega was moving against them, Lulzburg was compromised, and they still didn't know how deep the corruption reached. But for the first time since learning the truth about his brother's death, Clyde felt ready for the fight. Because now he wasn't fighting alone. The next 4 days blurred together in a haze of evidence gathering, secure communications, and carefully orchestrated moves against an enemy who seemed to anticipate their every strategy. Clyde found himself operating in a world he'd never imagined, one where his penthouse apartment was under surveillance, his corporate accounts were frozen pending investigation, and his every public appearance was choreographed by federal agents to maintain the illusion that he remained unaware of the conspiracy. But through it all, Stella was his constant companion, and what had begun as desperate attraction was deepening into something that made the danger around them feel almost secondary to the fear of losing what they'd found. "Benny's testimony is going to be crucial," Stella said, looking up from the laptop where she'd been reviewing depositions with the intensity of a surgeon preparing for a life-saving operation. They were in Agent Carlson's secure facility now, a nondescript office building in D.C. that housed enough classified material to topple governments. Benjamin Rodriguez, Marcus's former battle buddy, had agreed to testify about the equipment failures he'd witnessed firsthand. The man who'd lost his leg to Vega's faulty gear would finally have a chance to tell the truth about what was happening to American soldiers overseas. "He's risking everything," Clyde observed, studying the photographs of Rodriguez that Agent Carlson had provided. The former Marine bore the particular kind of composure that came from surviving hell and deciding that survival wasn't enough. You had to make it mean something. "So are we," Stella replied. But when she looked at him, her expression held warmth that had nothing to do with their professional alliance. Over the past 4 days, they'd fallen into a rhythm that felt natural, despite the extraordinary circumstances. Working late into the night, sharing takeout meals over classified documents, stealing moments of conversation that had nothing to do with the conspiracy. Clyde had learned that Stella took her coffee black and preferred jazz to classical music. That she'd grown up wanting to be a prosecutor because her father had been wrongfully convicted of a crime he didn't commit. That she'd joined the military because she believed in justice, but left because she'd discovered how often justice was sacrificed for convenience. And she'd learned that beneath his CEO exterior, Clyde Knox was a man who remembered every employee's birthday, who'd personally visited the families of every soldier saved by Knox Defense Equipment, who carried Marcus's dog tags in his pocket because the weight of them reminded him why his work mattered. "Agent Carlson wants to brief us on the Pentagon meeting," Stella said, but she made no move to close the laptop or stop the conversation they'd been having about everything except the case. "In a minute," Clyde replied, moving from his chair to sit beside her on the small couch that had become their unofficial workspace. "I want to ask you something first." The proximity sent familiar electricity through both of them. After 4 days of careful professional boundaries, punctuated by moments of devastating honesty, they developed an awareness of each other that made every casual touch feel significant. "What happens after?" he asked. "When this is over, when Vega is in prison and the conspiracy is exposed and Marcus gets the justice he deserved, what happens to us?" Stella's hand stilled on the keyboard. It was a question they'd been dancing around for days. The elephant in the room that grew larger every time they shared a knowing look or found excuses to work close enough that their shoulders touched. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've been so focused on getting justice for Marcus that I haven't let myself think about what comes next." "I have," Clyde said quietly. "I've been thinking that 3 years ago I lost my brother and thought I'd never feel whole again. But working with you, seeing your passion for what's right, the way you've honored Marcus's memory, you've given me something I didn't know I was missing. Clyde, I know it's complicated. I know we're from different worlds, different backgrounds. I know you probably have every reason not to trust a billionaire CEO who was stupid enough to let himself get manipulated for 3 years." His voice carried the self-recrimination that still haunted him, despite everything they discovered about Vega's sophisticated manipulation. "That's not what I see when I look at you," Stella said softly, turning to face him fully. "I see a man who loved his brother enough to build an empire to honor his memory. I see someone who was willing to risk everything when he learned the truth, who chose justice over comfort, even when it meant losing everything he'd worked for." The intensity in her dark eyes made his heart race. "What else do you see?" "I see someone who makes me believe that maybe fighting for justice doesn't have to mean fighting alone." The space between them disappeared as naturally as breathing. This time, when Clyde kissed her, there was no desperate grief driving them together, no crisis forcing them to seek comfort in each other's arms. This kiss was about choice, about recognizing that what they'd found together was worth protecting, just as fiercely as they were protecting Marcus's memory. When Stella's hands tangled in his hair, when she made that soft sound of surrender that drove him absolutely wild, Clyde understood that he was in love with her. Not just attracted, not just grateful for her partnership in seeking justice, but completely, irrevocably in love with this brilliant, fearless woman who'd risked everything to honor his brother. "We should probably," Stella began when they broke apart. So whatever responsible thing she'd been about to say was forgotten when Agent Carlson's voice crackled over the intercom. "Knox, Bridges, conference room, now, we've got movement on multiple fronts." The spell between them broke as reality crashed back in. But this time, Instead of the awkwardness that had followed their first kiss, Clyde felt a sense of partnership that went deeper than attraction. They were in this together now, in every sense that mattered. The conference room was filled with the controlled chaos of a federal operation in its final stages. Admiral Rachel Sterling appeared on the main screen via secure video link, her decorated uniform and steely determination providing a stark reminder of what they were fighting for. At 52, she commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation, and the fact that she was willing to risk court-martial to expose the conspiracy spoke to the depth of the corruption they were facing. "Vega knows we're closing in," Admiral Sterling reported without preamble. "Intelligence suggests he's planning to eliminate key witnesses before the congressional hearing." "What kind of elimination?" Stella asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "The permanent kind." Benjamin Rodriguez received a visit from unknown men claiming to be VA investigators. His apartment was searched while he was out. "We've moved him to protective custody, but Vega's people are escalating." Clyde felt ice form in his chest. "What about other witnesses?" "Admiral Sterling herself is under protection," Agent Carlson added. "But there are others who provided information during the investigation. We're doing our best to secure them all, but Vega has resources and connections we're still mapping." "He's going to come after me directly," Clyde realized. "I'm the biggest threat to his operation because I can prove Knox Defense was built as a cover story. If I disappear or have an accident, it becomes his word against a dead man's." "Absolutely not," Stella said sharply, her protective instincts flaring with an intensity that made his pulse quicken for reasons that had nothing to do with danger. "We're not using you as bait." "I'm not talking about bait. I'm talking about taking the fight to him before he can eliminate everyone who knows the truth." The room fell silent as the implications of what he was suggesting sank in. Agent Carlson leaned forward, her ice-blue eyes assessing him with new interest. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "Vega taught me everything I know about strategic thinking, but he made one crucial mistake. He assumed I'd never be smart enough or strong enough to turn his own tactics against him." Clyde's voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who'd finally stopped underestimating himself. "He's planning to take control of Knox Defense at tomorrow's emergency board meeting. I think we should let him try." "Clyde, no," Stella said, moving closer to him with alarm written across her features. "If you walk into that boardroom, you'll be walking into a trap, not if we set a better trap first." Agent Carlson's expression had shifted to one of professional interest. "Go on." "Knox Defense Industries has been clean throughout this entire conspiracy. Every contract, every piece of equipment, every innovation, it's all legitimate. The only corruption in my company came from Vega's influence on my decision-making, not from any actual illegal activity." "We know that," Stella said impatiently. "But how does that help us?" "Because if Knox Defense is clean, then its records can prove the conspiracy exists. Every contract Vega guided me away from, every competitor he warned me against, every piece of advice he gave me about bidding strategies, it's all documented in my corporate files. And tomorrow, when he tries to take control of my company, I'm going to give him exactly what he wants." The dangerous smile that crossed Clyde's face made Stella's heart race with a mixture of admiration and terror. "You're going to confess to being part of the conspiracy." "I'm going to confess to everything, publicly. In front of the board, the media, and everyone else Vega has invited to witness my downfall. I'm going to tell them that I've been working with federal investigators to expose a conspiracy that reaches deep into the Pentagon's procurement system. And Vega will be trapped in that room with you when you do it," Agent Carlson said, understanding dawning in her voice, with no way to run, no way to deny his involvement, and no way to eliminate the witnesses who are already in federal custody. Clyde looked at Stella, seeing his own determination reflected in her dark eyes. "It's the only way to end this without giving him time to disappear or hurt anyone else." "It's also incredibly dangerous," Stella pointed out. "If something goes wrong, if he suspects what you're planning, then you'll be there to make sure nothing goes wrong," Clyde said, simply. "You're going to be my legal counsel at the board meeting." The surprise in her expression was quickly replaced by something that looked like pride. "You trust me that much?" I trust you with everything, he replied, and the weight of that trust, the completeness of it, settled between them like a promise. Admiral Sterling's voice came through the speakers, cutting through the intensity of the moment. I'll coordinate with the Congressional Committee to ensure we have legal authority to arrest Vega the moment he incriminates himself. But you understand the risk you're taking, Mr. Knox. If this goes wrong, Vega won't hesitate to eliminate both of you. Then we'd better make sure it doesn't go wrong, Stella said, her hand finding Clyde's as they faced the most dangerous part of their mission together. As the briefing continued and plans took shape around them, Clyde found himself thinking not about the risk they were about to take, but about the woman beside him who'd become his partner in every sense that mattered. Tomorrow, they would either expose the conspiracy that had killed his brother, or they would die trying. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged. July 1st arrived with the kind of perfect summer evening that made Washington, D.C. almost magical despite its political darkness. Agent Carlson had cleared Clyde's penthouse apartment for one night, a calculated risk that would allow him to retrieve personal items and maintain the appearance of normalcy before tomorrow's board meeting. But as Clyde stood in his own living room for the first time in a week, surrounded by the luxury he'd built to honor Marcus's memory, all he could think about was the woman standing beside him. "It's beautiful," Stella said, moving toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. The monuments were lit against the night sky, reminders of the principles they were risking their lives to defend. "It never felt like home until now," Clyde admitted, watching her silhouette against the lights. "I bought this place because Marcus always said that if you're going to succeed in D.C., you need to look like you belong here. But I think I've been waiting for the right person to share it with." Stella turned from the window, her dark eyes reflecting the city lights in a way that made his breath catch. They'd spent the day in final preparations for tomorrow's confrontation, reviewing legal strategies with federal prosecutors, coordinating with Admiral Sterling's congressional testimony, ensuring that every piece of evidence was properly documented for Vega's arrest. But now, in the quiet sanctuary of his apartment, the weight of what they were about to attempt settled over them both. "Are you scared?" she asked quietly. "Terrified," he replied honestly. "Not of Vega, not of losing my company or my reputation. I'm terrified of losing you." The admission hung between them with the weight of everything they hadn't said. Everything they'd been carefully not acknowledging while they focused on seeking justice for Marcus. But tonight, with the final battle hours away, Clyde found he couldn't pretend anymore that this was just about partnership or attraction or even love. This was about finding the other half of himself in a woman who'd been willing to risk everything for his brother's memory. "You're not going to lose me," Stella said, moving closer to him with the kind of certainty that came from making a choice with your whole heart. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever Vega tries to do, we're in this together. Promise me," he said, reaching up to cup her face in his hands. "Promise me that if things go wrong, you'll get out of there. Don't try to save me if it means putting yourself in danger." "Don't ask me to make a promise I can't keep," she replied, covering his hands with hers. "You wouldn't abandon me if our positions were reversed." "That's different." "No, it's not. It's exactly the same." Her voice carried the fierce determination he'd come to love, the unwavering moral compass that had driven her to seek justice for 3 years. "We protect each other, Clyde. That's what partners do." The kiss that followed was different from the desperate comfort they'd found in each other a week ago. Different even from the growing passion they'd shared over the past few days. This kiss was a promise, a claiming, an acknowledgement that whatever tomorrow brought, tonight belonged to them alone. When Stella's hands moved to the buttons of his shirt, when her touch sent fire racing through his veins, Clyde felt the last of his carefully maintained control slip away. 3 years of emotional walls, of protecting himself from the possibility of loss, of focusing on work to avoid feeling too deeply. All of it crumbled under the gentle pressure of her hands and the honesty in her dark eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with want and something deeper. "I've never been more sure of anything," she whispered against his lips. "I love you, Clyde Knox. Not because you're fighting for Marcus, not because you're risking everything for justice, I love you because you're the kind of man who builds empires to honor the people he's lost. Because you're strong enough to admit when you've been wrong. Because you trust me with your heart, even when the world is falling apart around us. The words hit him like absolution and benediction combined. I love you too, he said, and saying it felt like coming home after years of wandering. I love your courage and your compassion and the way you never give up on what's right. I love that you see the best in people even when they've disappointed you. I love that you made me believe I could be worthy of Marcus's sacrifice. What followed was a slow exploration of trust made manifest. Of two people who found in each other the courage to be completely vulnerable. Clyde's hands traced the elegant curve of Stella's neck, marveling at the way she shivered under his touch, at the soft sound she made when he found the sensitive spot just below her ear. Her skin was warm silk under his palms, and every kiss she pressed to his throat felt like a benediction. When she looked up at him, her eyes bright with emotion and desire, Clyde saw his own reflection transformed. Not the isolated CEO who'd built walls to protect himself from loss, but a man worth loving, worth fighting beside, worth trusting with someone's whole heart. I want to remember this, Stella whispered as he lifted her against him, as her legs wrapped around his waist and her hands fisted in his hair. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want to remember what it feels like to be loved by you. You're going to have a lifetime to remember, he promised, carrying her toward his bedroom, where moonlight streamed through windows that overlooked the monuments they were fighting to protect. Because we're both walking out of that boardroom alive, and we're going to build something beautiful together. In the sanctuary of his bedroom, with the city spread out below them like a promise of the future they were fighting for, they discovered each other with the reverence of people who understood how precious and fragile love could be. Every touch was a conversation, every kiss a promise, every whispered endearment a declaration of faith in what they could build together. Clyde worshipped her with the devotion of a man who'd thought he'd lost the capacity for wonder, tracing patterns on her skin that spoke of adoration and need in equal measure. And Stella gave herself to him with the completeness of a woman who'd finally found someone worthy of her trust, someone who saw her strength as beauty and her passion for justice as sacred. When they moved together in perfect rhythm, when the world outside ceased to exist, except for the haven they'd created in each other's arms, Clyde understood that this was what Marcus had died protecting. Not just American soldiers, but the idea that love and honor and justice were worth any sacrifice. You know those moments in life when everything crystallizes into perfect clarity? When you realize that all the pain and struggle and uncertainty has been leading you to exactly where you need to be? That's what love at its deepest level feels like. Not just passion or companionship, but the absolute certainty that you've found your other half, the person who makes you brave enough to fight for something bigger than yourself. Later, as they lay entwined in the aftermath of their complete surrender to each other, Stella traced lazy patterns on Clyde's chest while he played with her hair and tried to memorize the weight of her in his arms. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice drowsy with satisfaction. "I'm thinking about Marcus," he admitted. "About how he always said that life isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice for the people you love. I think he would have liked you." "I think I would have liked him too." Stella pressed a kiss to his heart, right over the steady rhythm that belonged to her now. "He would be proud of what you're doing tomorrow." "What we're doing," Clyde corrected. "I couldn't face Vega without you. I wouldn't want to." "Good," she said with a smile he could hear in her voice. "Because you're stuck with me now, Knox, for whatever comes next." As they drifted toward sleep, still wrapped in each other's arms, Clyde felt something he hadn't experienced since before his parents died. The absolute certainty that he wasn't facing the future alone. Tomorrow would bring danger and possibly death, but it would also bring the chance to honor Marcus's memory and build something clean and honest from the wreckage of Vega's conspiracy. And whatever happened, he would face it with the woman he loved beside him. The woman who taught him that justice and love weren't opposing forces, but complementary ones, that fighting for what's right was always easier when you had someone worth fighting for. The last thing he remembered before sleep claimed them both was the sound of fireworks in the distance, early 4th of July celebrations that reminded him that tomorrow wasn't just about exposing a conspiracy. It was about freedom, about the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the cost is everything you've built. But as he held Stella against his heart, Clyde Knox realized he'd already found his independence in loving a woman brave enough to fight beside him. The call that shattered their peaceful morning came at 6 a.m., jarring them both awake with the harsh reality that their enemies hadn't spent the night celebrating love and planning futures. Vegas moved up the timeline. Agent Carlson's voice crackled through the secure phone. The board meeting is in 3 hours, not tonight. And he's brought additional security, former military contractors who aren't bound by the same legal restrictions as federal agents. Clyde was instantly alert, his mind racing through the implications while Stella sat up beside him, already reaching for her clothes with the efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis. "How many additional?" he asked. "6 that we've identified. Possibly more. All of them have kill authorizations from foreign governments and no particular loyalty to American law enforcement." The message was clear. Vega wasn't planning to let them walk out of that boardroom alive, regardless of how much evidence they'd gathered or how many federal agents were standing by. He was going to eliminate the threat to his empire the same way he'd eliminated Marcus, with overwhelming force and careful planning. "We abort," Stella said immediately, her protective instincts flaring. "We find another way to get him." "There isn't another way," Clyde replied, though every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to find a solution that didn't involve putting her in danger. "If we don't show up today, Vega will disappear and all the witnesses will start having accidents. This is our only shot. Then we get more backup. We wait until Admiral Sterling testifies to Congress this afternoon," he interrupted gently. "If Vega isn't in custody by then, she'll be walking into her own assassination. We can't protect everyone, Stella, but we can end this today." The look she gave him was filled with love and terror in equal measure. "I know you're right. I can't lose you, Clyde. Not when we've just found each other." "You're not going to lose me," he promised, pulling her into his arms for what might be the last time. "Because I have something to live for now, something worth fighting for." As they prepared for the most dangerous morning of their lives, as they armed themselves with legal documents and federal wire transmissions, and the absolute certainty that they were fighting for justice, Clyde Knox realized that loving Stella Bridges had given him something more valuable than all the strategic training Vega had provided. It had given him a reason to win. The Knox Defense Industries boardroom had been transformed into a theater of judgment, with news cameras positioned strategically around the mahogany conference table and enough legal documentation to fill a small library. Clyde Knox walked into the room at exactly 9 a.m. on July 2nd, wearing his most expensive suit like armor and carrying himself with the confidence of a man who'd already decided that dying for the truth was preferable to living with lies. Stella followed 2 steps behind him, her role as his legal counsel providing cover for the federal recording equipment hidden in her briefcase, and the direct communication link to Agent Carlson's tactical team. She looked every inch the brilliant advocate she was, but Clyde could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her dark eyes cataloged every face in the room for potential threats. Max Vega sat at the head of the table, like a king holding court, his silver hair perfectly styled and his former SEAL bearing radiating the kind of authority that had made desperate young men trust him with their futures. At 55, he was still physically imposing, and the way his pale eyes tracked Clyde's movements suggested a predator evaluating prey. "Clyde, son," Vega said, rising with arms extended in what looked like paternal welcome. "I'm so relieved you've come to your senses. This whole situation has been a terrible misunderstanding." "Has it?" Clyde replied, taking his seat at the opposite end of the table. "Because I've been doing the lot of thinking this week, and I'm starting to realize just how many things I've misunderstood over the years." The other board members, investors and advisors who'd helped build Knox Defense from Vega's initial contacts, shifted uncomfortably. Several of them avoided Clyde's gaze entirely, their complicity in the conspiracy written across faces that couldn't quite hide their guilt. "Of course you're confused," Vega continued smoothly. "When someone fills your head with wild conspiracy theories about your brother's death, when they convince you that the people who love you most are somehow your enemies, well, it's natural to feel overwhelmed." "The people who love me most," Clyde repeated thoughtfully, like Judge Wellsberg. A mention of his godfather's name sent a visible ripple of tension through the room. Vega's expression remained composed, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Teddy is very concerned about you, Clyde. We all are. That's why we've arranged for the best possible legal representation to help you through this difficult time." Vega gestured toward a table of lawyers Clyde didn't recognize, clearly corporate defense attorneys prepared to manage his confession and minimize damage to Vega's empire. "I appreciate that," Clyde said, his voice carrying just enough gratitude to maintain the illusion that he was still the naive protégé Vega believed him to be. "But I think I'd prefer to keep Miss Bridges as my counsel. After all, she knew Marcus." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Vega's pale eyes fixed on Stella with the intensity of a sniper acquiring a target, and several of his security consultants shifted their positions around the room's perimeter. "Miss Bridges," Vega said, his voice carrying a silky threat, "the ambitious young JAG officer who's been filling my boy's head with nonsense about equipment failures and military conspiracies. I was hoping we have a chance to meet." "The feeling is mutual," Stella replied evenly. "I've been very interested in your work, Mr. Vega, particularly your innovations in body armor design." The accusation hung in the air, like smoke from a discharged weapon. Everyone in the room understood that they were no longer engaging in corporate theater. This was a confrontation between people who knew exactly what the stakes were. "I think," Vega said slowly, "that it's time you dispensed with pretense. Clyde, you've been played by federal agents who want to use you to settle old scores. Miss Bridges has convinced you that I somehow caused Marcus's death, when the truth is much simpler and much more painful." "What truth is that?" Clyde asked, though every instinct he possessed was screaming danger. Vega opened a folder and slid a document across the table, one that made Clyde's blood freeze as he recognized his father's signature at the bottom. "Your father, Colonel William Knox, was the original architect of the procurement fraud that Ms. Bridges is so eager to expose. Marcus discovered his father's corruption and was planning to destroy the Knox family name with his testimony. I didn't kill your brother, Clyde. I was trying to protect you from learning that Marcus died hating everything your family represented." The lie was so perfectly calibrated to his guilt and grief that for a moment, Clyde felt the world tilt sideways. Vega had always been a master manipulator, but this was psychological warfare designed to break him completely. "That's not true," Stella said sharply, but Vega was already pressing his advantage. "Your father took millions in bribes to approve substandard equipment. Marcus was going to expose it all, and the shame would have destroyed your family's reputation forever. When I learned what he was planning, I tried to reason with him, to convince him that some truths are too destructive to reveal. But Marcus was stubborn, just like you. He wouldn't listen to reason. So you killed him," Clyde said quietly. "I arranged for an accident that would spare your family the humiliation of a public trial. I thought I was being merciful." Vega's voice carried the conviction of a man who'd convinced himself that murder was kindness. "Everything I've done since then, mentoring you, helping you build Knox Defense, guiding your success, it's all been to honor Marcus's memory while protecting you from the truth that would have destroyed you." The room fell silent, except for the soft hum of recording equipment and the distant sound of traffic outside. Clyde stared at the forged document, bearing his father's signature, understanding, finally, the full scope of Vega's manipulation. Not only had he orchestrated Marcus's murder, he'd spent 3 years positioning himself as Clyde's savior, while systematically destroying any chance of learning the truth. "The equipment failures," Clyde said. "The Marines who died using hexagon defense gear, that was my father's fault? That was war, son. Sometimes good men die because other good men make difficult choices. Your father was trying to provide the best possible equipment at the lowest possible cost. Sometimes corners get cut, and sometimes people pay the price. That's not corruption, that's reality." But even as Vega spun his lies with practiced ease, Clyde could see through them to the man underneath. A former SEAL who'd lost his own son to faulty equipment, who'd spent years building a corrupt empire while convincing himself he was protecting the young men who reminded him of what he'd lost. Max Vega wasn't evil. He was broken, and his brokenness had made him dangerous in ways that pure malice never could. "You really believe that, don't you?" Clyde asked. "You actually think you were protecting me?" "I know I was, and I'm trying to protect you now. Confess to being part of your father's conspiracy. Accept responsibility for Knox Defense's role in the procurement fraud. Take a plea deal that will give you a few years in minimum security instead of life in federal prison. Let me handle the aftermath." It was the final test, the moment when Vega expected 3 years of manipulation to pay off with Clyde's complete surrender. Around the room, cameras recorded every word while federal agents waited for the signal that would end the deadliest game any of them had ever played. "And if I refuse?" Clyde asked. Vega's composure finally cracked, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "Then you and Miss Bridges will have a very unfortunate accident leaving this building. Corporate espionage is a dangerous business, Clyde. Sometimes people get hurt when they threaten powerful interests." A threat was delivered with the casual tone of a weather report, but everyone in the room understood that it was absolutely sincere. Vega had killed before and would kill again, and the only thing standing between them and immediate execution was the pretense that this was still a business meeting. Almost imperceptibly toward her briefcase, where Agent Carlson's tactical team was monitoring every word. But before she could signal for backup, the conference room doors burst open to admit a figure that made everyone freeze in recognition. Judge Thaddeus Wellsberg entered the room like a man walking to his own execution, his usually perfect composure shattered by 3 sleepless nights and the weight of 30 years of compromise. At 68, he looked every day of his age, but his eyes held the kind of moral clarity that came from finally choosing the right side of an impossible situation. "Hello, Max," he said quietly. "Clyde, I think it's time we told the truth about everything." The silence that followed was deafening. Vega's face went white as he realized that his final insurance policy, the respected federal judge who'd been covering for him for 15 years, had just walked into the room to destroy them both. "Teddy," Vega said carefully, "I don't think this is the time or place." "This is exactly the time and place," Wellsberg interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades on the federal bench. "I've been protecting you for too long, and it's cost too many good people their lives. It ends today." Clyde stared at the man who'd raised him, seeing past the betrayal to the broken father figure who'd spent 15 years trying to protect him from a truth that had finally become too heavy to carry alone. "What really happened, Teddy?" he asked gently. "Your father was clean, Clyde. Colonel William Knox never took a bribe in his life, but I did." The admission came out like a confession that had been burning inside him for years. 15 years ago, I took money from defense contractors to bury investigations that would have exposed the procurement fraud. When Marcus discovered what was happening, when he came to me with evidence that could have saved hundreds of lives, I buried that too. And when Max told me that Marcus was going to expose everything, I helped him arrange for your brother's murder. The devastation in the room was complete. Board members who'd thought they were covering up financial irregularities realized they'd been accessories to murder. Vega's security team began moving toward the exits, as they understood that their employer's empire was collapsing in real time. But Clyde only had eyes for the broken man who'd been the closest thing to a father he'd had for half his life. "Why?" he asked, and the single word carried 30 years of love and trust and devastating betrayal. "Because I thought I was protecting you," Wellsberg whispered. "Because I couldn't bear the thought of losing another son to the truth." In the chaos that followed, federal agents bursting through the doors, weapons drawn, Vega's men surrendering as they realized their situation was hopeless, Clyde found himself thinking not about justice or revenge, or even relief that the conspiracy was finally exposed. He was thinking about forgiveness, and the terrible price of loving someone enough to destroy yourself trying to protect them. July 4th, 1 year later. The rooftop of Knox Defense Industries had been transformed into something Marcus would have loved. Not a corporate celebration of wealth and power, but a genuine Independence Day gathering where the employees who'd helped build something honest could celebrate with their families. Children ran between picnic tables laden with traditional barbecue, while their parents talked easily with the CEO, who remembered all their names, and the brilliant lawyer who'd become his wife. Clyde Knox stood at the edge of the rooftop terrace, watching his new sister-in-law Evangeline direct traffic around the dessert table with the organizational skills that had made her invaluable to Knox Defense's restructuring. In the year since the conspiracy's exposure, Evie had left the Pentagon to become the company's chief ethics officer, ensuring that the integrity Marcus had died for would never again be compromised. "Penny for your thoughts," Stella said, slipping her arms around his waist from behind and leaning against his back. The simple gold band on her finger caught the afternoon sunlight, a reminder of the small ceremony they'd held 6 months ago with only family and the people who'd fought beside them. "I was thinking about Marcus," he admitted, covering her hands with his own, "about how he always said that Independence Day wasn't about celebrating what we'd won, but about remembering what we'd committed to protect." Below them, the National Mall was filled with families gathering for the evening's fireworks display. From their elevated position, Clyde could see the monuments that Marcus had died defending, the symbols of principles that were worth any sacrifice when they were lived rather than merely proclaimed. "He would be proud of what you've built here," Stella said softly. "Not just the company, but the family. Look around, Clyde. This is what justice looks like when it's lived every day instead of just fought for." She was right. In the year since Max Vega's arrest and the exposure of the military procurement conspiracy, Knox Defense Industries had become something unprecedented in the defense industry, a company that prioritized soldier safety over profit margins, that shared innovations freely with competitors when lives were at stake, that treated every contract as a sacred trust with the families who depended on their equipment. The vindication had come at a cost. Judge Wellsberg had died in federal custody 6 months ago, his weak heart finally giving out under the weight of guilt and shame. But before his death, he'd recorded a full confession that had cleared Colonel William Knox's name and provided closure for a family that had carried undeserved shame for too long. "Benjamin should be here soon," Stella said, checking her watch. He wanted to bring his new class of veterans, advocacy students, to meet the people who made their scholarships possible. Benny Rodriguez had become one of their closest friends in the aftermath of the conspiracy's exposure. His testimony before Congress had been devastating in its honesty, and his work establishing legal aid clinics for veterans had given him a purpose that honored both his service and his sacrifice. The Knox Foundation's funding had allowed him to expand his advocacy program nationwide, ensuring that other veterans would never face the bureaucratic betrayals that had cost him his leg. "And Admiral Sterling," Clyde asked. "Confirmed for 7 p.m. She'll be here right after the congressional ceremony where they're officially naming the Marcus Knox Veterans Protection Act." Stella's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd seen justice become law. 3 years of mandatory inspections, whistleblower protections for military contractors, and criminal penalties for anyone who puts profit over soldier safety. The legislation had passed unanimously in both houses of Congress, a rare moment of bipartisan agreement that honored Marcus's sacrifice while ensuring that future conspiracies would be much harder to sustain. Admiral Sterling had been promoted to head the Pentagon's new Ethics and Accountability Division, a position created specifically to prevent the kind of systemic corruption that had cost so many lives. "Clyde," a familiar voice called from across the rooftop. Agent Iris Carlson approached with her typical direct stride. The civilian clothes and the genuine smile on her face made her look years younger than she had during the investigation. "Stella, beautiful ceremony." "I'm glad you could make it," Stella replied warmly. "How's the new assignment treating you?" "Counterterrorism is less personally complicated than corporate conspiracy," Carlson admitted with dry humor. "Though I have to say, I miss working with people who were actually trying to do the right thing." Over the past year, Agent Carlson had become an unexpected friend, someone who understood the weight of making life-and-death decisions and the cost of victory when good people didn't survive to see it. She'd been instrumental in ensuring that the prosecutions proceeding from their investigation were thorough and fair, even when political pressure mounted to limit the scope of accountability. "Any word on the sentencing?" Clyde asked. "Vega will serve life without parole. 23 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, 47 counts of fraud, and enough military equipment violations to keep him locked up for several lifetimes." Carlson's expression grew somber. "He's been writing you letters." Clyde wasn't surprised. For the past year, Max Vega had been sending correspondence from federal prison. Not threats or manipulations, but something that looked almost like attempts at genuine apology. Letters that revealed a broken man trying to understand how his desire to protect young soldiers had transformed into the very corruption that killed them. "I'm not ready to forgive him yet," Clyde said honestly. "Maybe someday, but not yet." "Forgiveness isn't about timing," Stella observed gently. "It's about understanding, and sometimes understanding takes longer than we expect." As the afternoon wore on, their celebration grew larger and more joyful. Employees brought their families. Contractors shared stories about equipment that had saved lives overseas, and new hires, fresh from engineering school, talked excitedly about innovations that would make American soldiers safer. The rooftop filled with the kind of genuine community that Marcus had always believed was possible when good people committed to protecting each other. At sunset, when the last of the official guests had arrived and the evening's more formal ceremony was about to begin, Clyde found himself back at the edge of the terrace with Stella, watching the lights come on across the monuments below. "Are you happy?" she asked, the simple question carrying all the weight of everything they'd survived together. "I'm complete," he replied, turning in her arms so he could see her face in the golden light. "A year ago, I thought honoring Marcus meant building something successful. Now I understand it means building something good." "And you're not afraid anymore? Of losing what we've built? Of someone trying to corrupt it? Of loving you so much that losing you would destroy me?" He smiled, brushing a strand of hair back from her face. "Terrified, but I'm also certain that fear isn't a reason to avoid building something beautiful." The kiss they shared was witnessed by 300 people and nobody at all. A moment of private intimacy in the middle of their very public celebration. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clyde rested his forehead against hers and tried to memorize the weight of her in his arms. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Sterling's voice carried across the rooftop as she approached the microphone they'd set up near the memorial wall. "If I could have your attention, please." The crowd quieted as the woman whose courage had made their victory possible prepared to speak. At 53, Admiral Rachel Sterling commanded respect through competence and compassion, her willingness to risk court-martial for the truth having transformed her into something approaching a national hero. "1 year ago today," she began, "we gathered evidence that exposed a conspiracy threatening the lives of American servicemen and women. That conspiracy was defeated not by government agencies or military investigations, but by 2 people who refused to let injustice stand unchallenged." The applause that followed was heartfelt, but Clyde barely heard it. His attention was focused on the memorial wall behind Admiral Sterling, where Marcus's photograph was surrounded by images of other soldiers whose lives had been saved by Knox defense equipment over the past year. 43 faces looking back at him, 43 families who would sleep safely because good people had chosen to build something honest. "But tonight isn't just about celebrating victory over corruption," Admiral Sterling continued. "It's about celebrating the principles that victory defended. The idea that love of country means more than flag-waving in parades. It means making sure that our commitment to freedom is lived every single day, in every decision we make, in every choice to put what's right ahead of what's profitable." Sometimes the most profound victories aren't the ones that make headlines or change laws, though those matter deeply. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that happen in human hearts, when broken people find the courage to heal, when isolated people discover they're not alone, when good people realize that their love for each other makes them stronger than any corruption they face. That's what Independence Day really celebrates. Not just political freedom, but the personal courage to build something beautiful together. As the formal ceremony concluded and fireworks began to light up the sky over Washington, Clyde found himself thinking not about the past year's victories, but about the future they were building together. Knox Defense Industries would continue to grow and innovate, but always within the ethical framework that Marcus had died defending. The Knox Foundation would extend its veteran advocacy programs, ensuring that Benny Rodriguez's work could reach every soldier who needed help navigating bureaucracy and seeking justice. And somewhere, in ways he was only beginning to understand, he and Stella would build a family together that honored both the sacrifices that had brought them together and the love that would carry them forward. "What happens now?" Stella asked as the last of the guests began filtering toward the elevators. As the cleanup began and the ordinary work of maintaining something good reasserted itself. "Now we keep building," Clyde replied simply. "We keep choosing what's right over what's easy. We keep protecting each other and the people who depend on us. We keep being worthy of Marcus's sacrifice." "And personally?" she asked with the smile that still made his heart race after a year of marriage. "Personally, I was thinking we might start working on giving Marcus a nephew or niece to spoil." The joy in her laugh was bright enough to compete with the fireworks overhead. "I think you would like that very much." As they stood together on the rooftop where it had all begun, surrounded by the evidence of what good people could build, when they refused to compromise their principles, Clyde Knox understood that he'd finally found what Marcus had always known he was searching for. Not just success, but significance. Not just wealth, but worth. Not just independence, but the interdependence that came from loving someone completely and being loved the same way in return. The conspiracy that had killed his brother was defeated. The corruption that had threatened American soldiers was exposed. The company built to honor Marcus's memory had become something that would make him proud. But more than any of that, Clyde Knox had learned that the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies. It's building something so beautiful and honest and good that it becomes impossible for corruption to take root. And as fireworks exploded overhead while he held his wife in his arms, he realized that Marcus would have been proud of that lesson most of all. If you've ever wondered whether love and justice can coexist, whether fighting for what's right is worth the cost, or whether good people can really triumph over corruption when they're willing to stand together, well, Clyde and Stella's story reminds us that the answer is always yes, as long as we're brave enough to keep building something beautiful together. What moments in your own life have required you to choose between what's safe and what's right? How has love given you the courage to fight for something bigger than yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing from you. Tomorrow, we'll explore another story of love conquering corruption, of people finding the courage to protect what matters most. Until then, remember that every day is an opportunity to build something worthy of the people we love, and that Independence Day isn't just about celebrating freedom, it's about living free every single day. Like this video if Clyde and Stella's story moved you. Subscribe for more tales of love and courage, and I'll see you tomorrow for another story that will remind you why love always wins when good people refuse to give up.